Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Thursday's lecture number 4 out of 5. And I hope everyone's well. Thanks for joining today. We're going to continue our journey up the West Coast and explore areas further to the north today. I wanted to start by first answering the question that was asked yesterday about earthquakes. So this is a figure 50 from my book West Coast, A Natural History, and it shows you each dot representing an earthquake epicenter. So this is for, on the left, the entire West Coast, and then there's a blow up of this box here of our area at the southwestern tip. And the size of the dots better seen on the blow up. You can see all the little tiny dots. And then there are several larger white dots. And these relate to the magnitude of the earthquake. So as you can see, the bulk of the earthquakes are relatively low magnitude of scale 1 to 2 or 3, which means you would hardly feel them. But there have been several in the 5 to 6 and slightly over 6 range. The one was in Tolbach here, and the other one historically was along the Milnerton Fault up there. And so, as I mentioned, we do have a record of earthquakes, and this shows the recorded earthquakes that have been recorded by seismometers through to today. And geologically, it's interesting because normally for our sort of setting, you wouldn't expect earthquakes. And so how do we explain earthquakes? Well, this is a topic I focus more on in my first book, The Rocks and Mountains of Cape Town. And just briefly, on the right here is the map of Africa, showing you the topography. And many of you would be familiar with the East African Rift, which is running here from the Red Sea south through to southern Africa. And the warm colors here are higher elevations, so you can see the Rift Mountains. Mount Kilimanjaro would be among those in here. So the Rift Valley has earthquakes and it has volcanoes because that's where a plume of mantle rock, hot mantle rock, is nearing the surface. Further to the south, we have this elevated terrain called the Southern African Plateau. You can see it's very large, goes from southern Zambia all the way to South Africa. And this high elevated feature is unclear as to why it exists. But one idea shown here on the left is that there's a plume of hot mantle material named the African superswell that is pushing up from the hot interior of the earth towards the outer part, and that is causing this uplift. And with that uplift is also associated earthquakes, and eventually the idea is the East African Rift system might extend to the south, cutting through here, and it's possible that in the distant future we could have a similar feature as the Red Sea opening up through the Rift Valley if it continues to rift apart. But that's uncertain, and we'll have to wait probably many millions of years to see if in fact that happens. But that's sort of the story of the earthquakes in answer to that question. and kind of gives you an overall plate tectonic setting for our area. Right, so let's carry on then. Now this is lecture 4. And what we've done in lectures 1, 2, and 3 is we've tended to focus primarily in sort of an area on the West Coast that's roughly about an hour and a half drive from Cape Town. And so areas that are very accessible for those who live in Cape Town. What I want to do today is extend our travels further north, going to areas such as Verlorenvlei, the Olifants River mouth, Vanrhyns Pass and Vanrhynsdorp and Nieuwoudtville area, Springbok area and Namaqualand, up across the Orange River into Namibia, the Orange River mouth, Ice and the Fish River Canyon, and then eventually lead over to Lüderitz and Kolmanskop and look at some of the features there along the coast. And I just also, sorry, there's one other item I wanted to comment on before we start today's lecture. And that is, thanks to those of you who have ordered books. I have received your orders and your payment. For whatever reason, when I tried to respond to your emails, the emails I sent were rejected. I don't know why. And I'm having them look into it. So I'm sorry you haven't heard back from me, but I hopefully will be able to sort that out and you'll hear back from me soon. But just to know that I have received your orders and I am busy organizing that the books are delivered to you. So hopefully some of you will be getting them soon or certainly early next week. All right, so let's start our journey. Now, one thing to notice, and this is the satellite image, composite image for all of Southern Africa. Remember we mentioned in the first lecture how dry the West Coast is. And that's certainly the case for the Namib Sand Sea and Lüderitz and north of the Orange River. Also, Namaqualand is quite dry. So one of the features about going further north is things tend to dry out. And why is that? Well, the climate is largely related to the ocean currents. And so the image here on the left shows you in color the sea surface temperatures. So for Southern Africa, we have a very warm current, the Agulhas current, which comes down the east coast. And this warm current comes along the Agulhas bank, and then it does a weird thing where it just sort of turns and retroflects back into the Indian Ocean. We then have the South Atlantic current, colder water, coming along from the polar regions. And this then rotates around into the Benguela current. There's also a Benguela coastal current, but there's also what's called the Benguela Upwelling System, abbreviated here as BUS, B-U-S. And you can see that this is a real cold fringe along the South African and Namibian coastal regions, with water temperatures on the order of only 13 or 14 degrees, as opposed to 24, 25 degrees for the Agulhas current on the East Coast. So one of the explanations for why the West Coast is so dry, and has been since the initiation of Northern Hemisphere glaciation about 2.6 million years ago, is that the wind patterns have induced this transport of surface waters offshore, and that results in upwelling of colder, deeper waters to the surface. And they also, of course, bring nutrients, and that's why the West Coast is such a rich, fertile ground for fisheries, because we have huge, well, at least we used to have huge stocks of fish. Overfishing is an issue now and a problem, but historically it's been a very productive coast, and always very cold. So you definitely feel that when you go for a swim, how cold the waters are very near into shore. Another interesting climate feature of this system are the bergwind conditions. And this is on the right here, this shows you a NASA satellite image. Here's the Orange River, Cape Town's way down here, and here's Lüderitz. And you can see these beautiful plumes of sand and dust coming off of the land and being blown out to sea. And certainly we would be familiar with that. We had a fairly good bergwind condition not too long ago in Cape Town, where daytime highs got up into the low, to near 30 degrees. And what that does is it distributes a lot of brown haze and dust in the air. And when the next winter front passes through, this dust and material gets rained out. And in a separate study, a student of mine worked on documenting how the rain out of that dust provides an important nutrient source to the Fynbos ecosystem, which is otherwise growing on very nutrient-poor sandstone soils. So the bergwind phenomenon is quite interesting and provides a very nice respite from a cold, wet winter. People can finally hang their laundry out and it actually dries. Now, one of the consequences of the Benguela Upwelling System is that we have along our shelf offshore very large phosphate deposits. You might recall that in the other lectures, way down here at Yzerfontein and at the West Coast Fossil Park, remember I said those were phosphate mines. And so that was the case when sea level was higher and you actually had phosphate deposited that's now on shore. But the bulk of the phosphate, shown here in yellow, blues, and reds on the edge, are offshore. And the richest deposits are off of Namibia, and in this white box, we have a blow up of it on the left, which shows there's your Namib Desert. This is Walvis Bay to the north. Here's Lüderitz at the southern end. And this patch of green, light blue, and purple represent highly phosphatic sediment. And there's been a lot of discussion and exploration around potentially mining that phosphate because it's a valuable commodity for making fertilizers to grow more crops. So that's just to point out that that cold upwelling water has a long history. In the case of Namibia, going back to the about 5-6 million years. Off of South Africa extends back even further to 20-odd million years ago. All right, so as we go north, remember last time we were right over here at Saldanha Bay and Longabon Lagoon. If you carry up the R27, you get to Veldrift on the banks of the Berg River. You can then either carry on up the coast on dirt roads, or you can come over to Piketberg and go up through here to Elands Bay and Verlorenvlei, Lambert's Bay. There's the Olifants River Valley with Citrusdal and Clan William. And if you carry on the N7, you'll get to Vanrhyns Pass. And if you carry on to the east, you'll go up onto the Great Escarpment, up on the Vanrhyns Pass to Nieuwoudtville. And if you carry on that road, you get to Calvinia, okay? And so what I want to start with is we're going to work our way north, okay? So we're going to start with this region. I'm going to show you some features of Elands Bay and Verlorenvlei. And we're going to look at some areas around Vanrhynsdorp. And we're then going to proceed to go on up the west coast on the N7. The route is pretty straightforward because the N7 is really the major tarred road that takes you to Springbok and then eventually to the Namib border. There are lots of other roads, dirt roads, and I'll mention some of those because they're actually in very good condition and very drivable. And although rather isolated, you have very spectacular drives if you have the time to go through some really very beautiful country, which I'll try to show you at least a bit about today. The other point I want to make about this slide is this is the Greater Cedarburg Biodiversity Area. You can see the various corridors that they have tried to maintain to allow for plant and animals to be able to exist and move along these various corridors from the coast of Yon's Bay all the way into the Great Escarpment to the east, as well as from the south into the north. And as I mentioned, the Cape Fold Belt's in pretty good shape because people don't farm it, or not very much, because it's too rocky and rugged. So one of the critical aspects here is trying to preserve some of these lowland areas, which have tended to be far more farmed than the mountain areas. Okay, now what we're going to do is I'm going to show you like a geological cross-section across the southern portion here, cutting through the Piketberg, through the Swartland, over to the Cedarburg, and then we're going to have a look at Vanrhyns Pass. So first on the bottom here, you can see this is meant to try to show you a cross-section through the landscape. So here we have Piketberg. Here's the Swartland, where they grow all the winter wheat. And then here is the Cedarburg Mountains to the east and the Olifants River Valley cutting through them. And then the cross sections showing you that it's the Table Mountain Group sandstones that have been folded on top of this Malmesbury Group shale, and that extends over to Piketberg. So the Piketberg is like what we call an erosional outlier to the west of the main Cedarburg Mountains to the east. And if you can use your imagination, at one point, the Table Mountain Group sandstones arched over the Swartland as what would then have been a mountain and would have come down to rejoin the beds here at Piketberg. And that's what these purple dashed lines represent. And then this whole fold was plunging down to the north, okay? And that's why you can see this outline of it in this sort of V-shaped feature in the landscape. So if you go on the N7, you cut across from Piketberg across the Swartland to the Pioneers Kloof Pass, and you can go into the Olifants River Valley. You can work your way over to Fleurenflay and to Elands Bay. And if you go a bit further north to Vanrhynsdorp and then up to the pass, this is what it looks like. So here's the pass at the top on the left, and then looking out over this coastal plain, which is relatively flat, eroded land, and then this dramatic escarpment, the Great Escarpment, going up to this plateau. That's the edge of that Southern African plateau that I mentioned earlier. So really a spectacular view from there. And I highly recommend it. It would be on the way to Calvinia, and it's a lovely drive. If you go to Vanrhynsdorp, this is what you see. This is taken from a guest farm, the Mascom guest farm, which is just south of Vanrhynsdorp. So we're on the coastal plain, the flat part, and you're looking up the escarpment to the top of the plateau there. This is what's called the Mascomberg. Giftberg is around the corner. And this is in springtime, very popular time to go because you have, of course, the Namaqualand daisies. And I don't know if you can see it, but you see these yellow spots. So these are where a certain floral element is more abundant than in other areas. And they are associated with what are called hillikes, spelled out there, which are basically ancient termite mounds. And so the expression of those ancient termite mounds is given in their slightly more nutrient-rich soils, finer grained soils, that give rise to different plants being able to thrive there. In this case, it's a yellow flowering plant. I don't know what species it is. And it's quite a spectacular sight. Now, even when you're not going through in springtime, if you look as you go across the Swartland at the plowed fields, you should be able to see these large circular mounds of these huvikis that exist over that coastal plain. They're quite abundant. So once you see them, you'll start to see them everywhere. The other thing to point out is if you, like at this farm, walked around, you can find stone tools. Here at the lower right are some Silcrete stone tools that were made by humans, our ancestors, for cutting and whatever. And then these two dark stones are Dolerite stone tools that were found on a kopje in the Karoo Dolerite dikes. And here now we're at the same site, same farm, and you can see this patch of ground. It's littered with stones. And I've helped you spot the two hand axes by circling them. There's one here and one there. And they may not look like that different from the other stones around them, but if you pick them up, you'll see that they are clearly stone tools. Here's one up in the upper left here to give you an example. And you can see this classic sort of teardrop shape. And they're called hand axes because it was believed they were used while held in the hand, as demonstrated on the right. They're fairly heavy. They could have certainly been able to break through an animal skull to get to the brain and processing large carcasses. They don't believe they were hafted to a wooden tool handle, but were used in the hand. And this site may have been particularly popular in the past because on the left, you can see here is an outcrop of this lighter colored stone, whitish stone. This is, I believe, what's called a tufa. And that's where a spring would have come out. And where it came out, it would have precipitated a carbonate cement, which is what you're seeing here. This region has the Namaqualand marble deposits, and they used to quarry that marble as a facing stone. They don't do it any longer, but you can see the old quarries where they used to mine the marble. The other feature here, so there was water that was critical to humans who lived there. And the other thing is you have these outcrops of what are called silcrete, which is very hard, glassy quartz, fine-grained quartz rock. And it's out of silcrete that they would have made their stone tools. Very good raw material for making stone tools. So I think that's why that site had those features, promoting the habitation by our ancestors. If you go up Vanrhyns Pass and you go to Nieuwoudtville, turn south on the dirt road, you only have to go maybe about 10, 20 Ks south, and you'll get to a signpost. It's just off the road. That's my car there, parked on the road. There's the telephone poles. And it's a farm where is allowed access through a gate. And there's a geological little plaque. And you can see this very spectacular feature, which is called a glacial pavement. And it's at Kloof, just south of Nieuwoudtville. And the idea is that these grooves, these long linear grooves you see cut into this sandstone rock, were formed by the glacier as it moved through the sediment before it was lithified. And then later it got buried and lithified, and it preserved these track marks of the glacier moving over the sediment. So that's quite spectacular. And that would have happened during the time of the Dwyka ice sheets, which was around 250 to 300 million years ago. And then I already mentioned Eland's Bay, so I won't dwell on this too much, but Eland's Bay is a lovely spot to visit. as is Verlorenvlei, immediately adjacent to it. And it has the Deep Kloof rock shelter, which is up above Verlorenvlei, and has these amazing engraved fragments of ostrich eggshell, probably used as water canteens, perhaps in the hunting down of animals by literally running them to heat exhaustion and then killing them quite easily once they collapse from heat exhaustion. And then around the corner here, if you go to Eland's Bay, if you go on the dirt tract, which goes around the point here and then carries on along the coast, right about there, just a few kilometers, you'll see there's a cave up on the hill, and that is the Eland's Bay Cave. And it's well worth a visit. It's open to the public. It's not terribly well marked, but I don't think you can miss it. It's a big open structure. This is a picture inside the cave looking out. And these are some pictures of the cave, the rock art. So these are some like digital features. Here's an animal, perhaps an eland, I'm not sure. And there's a record here from around 22,000 years ago of people. And what's valuable, as I mentioned, with cave sites is you have a stratigraphic layered context. The unfortunate thing about most deposits, like the ones I showed you near Maskam, is those are all surface deposits, and we don't really have a context in which to put them. This is the Olifant's river mouth, which I fortunately got a picture of out the plane window. That's why it has these weird colors, because of the polarized light. And you can see here's the ocean with the waves coming in. Here's the actual Olifant's river, and it's exiting into the ocean. And what's interesting here, it's near the town of Poppendorp, which you can visit, and you can walk out onto this area. Here's a salt pan to the left, this white area. And here's the salt marsh area from the inflow of seawater periodically. And then here's the proper river here. And as I mentioned, the saltwater wedge can also extend quite far up the Olifant's river. And what's interesting here is you can see, unlike the Berg River, there's been no permanent opening made. So what typically happened in the past with these rivers that haven't been modified is the sand dune. Remember, the sand's coming from the south, so it's going across this slide to the right. And during summer, when the flow of the river is low, the sand can build up and it can block this river. And the river water can build up behind this dune system. And then eventually in winter, when the rains come, the water gets high enough, it breaches the dune. And once it does that, it can erode through and cut through it. So in some cases, you'll get a seasonal cutting off of the river flow into the ocean. Now, if you go to the south of here, you get to Strandfontein. And this is a picture here of the Strandfontein little village. You can camp there. There's campsites all along this area here, right on the beach. It's a lovely spot. And popular in the past, because if you go up on these bluffs, you'll find very rich shell middens. So the dump site of our ancestors who ate shellfish. This is a close-up on the right, showing you the many limpet shells, mussel shells, perlemon. And so this was a very popular spot for the strandloper groups that would go along the coast and harvest this very rich and easily accessible nutrient source of food. If you go to the north of the Olifant's river mouth, you'll get to Namaqualand Sands, which is a big mine, big open pit mine. And what they're mining there are what are called heavy minerals. And these consist of things like garnet, which is pink. That's what gives it this sort of rosy pink color. Ilmenite, which is black, and rutile, which is brown. And it occurs on the beaches. Here's a bulldozer actually bulldozing a beach deposit. And it also occurs up on the bluff in these thicker deposits that are being actively mined. So that's a major mineral resource on the West Coast. And once they finish mining these pits, they take the material that isn't the heavy minerals they're after and they refill them. They put the valuable surface soil aside and then they reapply the surface soil on top and they try to rehabilitate the landscape so it isn't scarred. So here is St. Helena Bay. This is Berg River in the far south. Here's Piketberg. We've come across here on the N7 through the Olifants River Valley. The Maskam is here. Vanrhyns is about there. And the Doreen River, which is sourced from the Tankwa Karoo, comes in through here, joins the Olifants River, which then flows out here in the northern part of St. Helena Bay. And Namaqualand Sands, that mine, is just to the north there. And it's believed that those heavy mineral sands are derived from a much earlier period when there was much greater amount of rain. You can see here the Chrome River Valley, which is now mostly dry. But in the past, when it was wetter, the water may have drained through here and fed a lot of the garnet, ilmenite, and rutile from those deposits into the Namaqualand sand deposit. Right, so now we're going to continue going north. We're going to go through an interesting area, the Kneftvlekte, and then from there up into Namaqualand. So the Kneftvlekte is Afrikaans for gnashing plain. It's the word to describe the sound of the wagon wheels as the voortrekkers made their way across the coastal plain. You can see these patches of sort of white stone gravels on the surface. And what these are quartz, the mineral quartz. You can see the close up here with these baby bottom succulents and all these little quartz grains in between. And that's from the vein quartz that cuts through the basement rock. And because it's so resistant to weathering, has remained behind and forms this surface of gravel. These are some of the other succulents. You're not allowed to take them. It's a preserve, and the succulent diversity is very great within this biome. But you can go to a nursery, and this is, for example, the thing I bought there, with an assortment of the indigenous succulents, and they sell those to the public. Then as you go north, you get into higher country, and the higher country is part of Namaqualand. So this is even older basement. It's about 1 billion years old, the rocks. And they are consisting of granite and gneissic rocks that form a belt along the western portion. They're certainly best known for their daisies, which are beautiful when they're in bloom. These are termite mounds here. And what you notice in the landscape is this really rounded shape of the granite. So the granite and the gneiss both weather by a process known as exfoliation. So it's like an unlayering of an onion layer. So these layers peel off. And as a consequence, the boulders that are outcropping are quite rounded like this one. And even in the distance, you get very rounded sort of peaks. And this is on the R355, the dirt road outside of Springbok. Springbok has a lot of these hills as well. And they're quite spectacular because, again, you can see that rounded shape of that weathering, and then the individual boulders weathering out as well to give it this interesting texture of weathered rock as the large granitic and gneissic bodies continue to weather. The animal life that you often don't see, a lot of it is nocturnal, such as the aardvark, shown here, captured by a trigger camera. But what you'll often notice is you'll see their holes where they nest or live. And some of these are, like this one is below a termite mound, so maybe was also interested in getting at the termites. So that's one of the animals you often see evidence of it, but you don't see it unless you drive around at night with a spotlight. Okay, now let's go up to the Orange River, further to the north, where the Orange River, of course, is the largest river coming out on the west coast. And it's a huge source of sediment that is originating from as far away as the Drakensberg Mountains in Lesotho. So this is the Orange River coming through here. It winds its way around and comes out there. Now, what happens is when the sediment in the Orange River reaches the coast, remember I mentioned to you last time the longshore drift, and that's a consequence of our swell, our ocean swell, coming from the southwest, hitting the coast obliquely, and then what it does is it forces the beach sand and gravel to move north. So when the Orange River puts out its sand and gravel, that moves north by longshore drift along the coast. The wind then can take it off the beaches, the sand, and it can blow it in these wind corridors. And basically that's what feeds this Namib sand sea to the north. So interestingly, most of this sand that makes up the Namib sand sea is actually from South Africa, well, from Lesotho and South Africa, eroded from the Orange River in the highlands far to the east, carried by the Orange River, carried north by longshore drift, and then the winds carry it into the Namib Sand Sea. And of course, along with all the quartz sand, it carries the diamonds. And that's why the diamonds tend to occur to the north of the Orange River. And that's where most of the mining has occurred. The mud, the finer material that gets suspended in the Orange River, comes further offshore. And in that case, it gradually settles to the seabed, but there's a poleward undercurrent flowing south, the bottom, sea bottom. This carries the mud south and forms this long tongue of brown color I've shown here as the mud belt. So instead of forming a large delta like the Mississippi River, the Orange River has a relatively small delta because the coarser sand sediment is shunted to the north and the finer sediment, the mud, is shunted to the south. So that's quite an interesting feature of the West Coast. And if you look at the Orange River near the mouth or further upstream, when the Orange River goes into major flood, here's a picture on the left of a major flow with full of mud, suspended mud. This, if it goes into a major flood, these waters can flood the dry tributaries downstream, and they can deposit what are called slack water deposits. And there's one there. And when you look closely, you see the birds, because it's soft enough, the birds have excavated their little nests into that. And these are very valuable because we can date them and we can determine when the Orange River flooded in the past. Now, some of you might be familiar with the large flood of 1988. It was a major flow of water, about 9,000 cubic meters. But there's evidence from the deposits that there were even larger floods in the past, maybe on the order of 3 times the size of the 1988 flood. So really spectacular volumes of water coming down, maybe on a cycle of about every 1,000 years. Then to the north, as we carry on, you can cut over, once you cross the border, you can cut over to the Fish River Canyon, which is spectacular. This is the viewpoint, famous viewpoint, showing you one of the big bends in the Fish River Canyon. You can see the basement rock here at the base, and these are overlain by horizontal beds of the Nama group. And the Nama group is interesting because it contains fossils. And here in the lower left is a blow-up of one of these fossils. It's a calcareous fossil, one of the earliest calcareous organisms that we know of, dating from about 560 million years ago. almost like you can see it's a cup within a cup. It's a little bit like a coral-like species. It's called Claudina. And that little perfect little hole right there is thought to be a predator that drilled into it to eat it. And these are preserved in this Nama group, along with other members of what's called the Ediacaran fossils, which represent the first animals in the fossil record. And they appear about 580 million years ago, and many of them go extinct by about 540 million years ago. So it's a very interesting area in terms of the paleontology. Fish River Canyon is also beautiful, and you can hike it, and you can also go to ice, and you can access it from there at the campsite. Beautiful scenery in the canyon with the river often not flowing, and rocks, lots and lots of rocks. And the basement rock, here's an example of the very metamorphosed gneissic rock, this banded, recrystallized rock that forms the basement. And in that region of southern Namibia, you can go to the Giant's Playground, where you can see what's called a tor, which is basically a stack of dolerite rocks that have been jointed into these blocks. So the reason it's called the Giant's Playground is because it's as if a giant had these blocks, building blocks, and they made various structures out of them. And what they represent are the weathering out of dolerite dikes. Remember, we talked about the breakup of Gondwana and the origin of the West Coast about 130 odd million years ago, and these would have been associated with that. And this is their weathered expression on the surface, and they can be quite spectacular. They're often associated as well with these koeberg trees, which are quite spectacular, in that they seem to appear to grow directly out of the rocks. And further north, not so much in this area, but further north, if you go to near Swakopmund, to the Namaqualand Park, you'll see the Welwitschia, which are famous for their longevity. Many of them are several thousand years old, and they have very deep tap roots that allow them to survive very arid conditions. And on the way just outside of Lüderitz is Kolmanskoop, which is an old mining town, and it's quite interesting to visit because you, of course, have the ruins left behind from the constant wind blowing sand, and the homes are gradually filling with sand. There's very little rainfall here, so otherwise things are exceptionally well preserved in the dry heat and cold, but there's very little rain, maybe only 35 to 50 millimeters a year. But the wind and the blasting of the sand is spectacular. And you can see that in the bedrock shown here on the upper right, where it's literally carved by the wind-blown sand. And in areas along Namibia, you actually get complete valleys carved out from the wind blasting the sand. This shows you one of the huge Barken dunes. These are people on top for scale. So these are like 35-meter high dunes, and they can move up to 50 meters a year. So really spectacular movement of sand. And that sand is all destined to go north through the corridor to the Namib Sand Sea. So it's like a direct feed. And remember, all this sand originally comes from the Orange River. And of course, with the sand are diamonds, maybe only 1 part in a million, or 1 grain in a million is a diamond, if that. They're very rare still. And this upper left picture shows you what some of the coastal diamonds look like, variety of colors. But in general, they're very good quality stones because they've managed to survive the long journey from the interior to the coast, then up the coast until they were recovered Here shows in the lower right how they were recovered originally by people literally crawling on their stomachs with tweezers and picking the diamonds off the wind-deflated valleys that I mentioned, blown by the wind. The diamond is another heavy mineral. It's more dense than sand, and so it tends to lag behind the sand and accumulate in these valleys, and they were able to pick them up originally from the surface. Now, today, what the NAMDEB has to do is they have to push the sea back and try to mine all the nooks and crannies. This would be north of the Orange River. And so this whole coastal region here has been heavily mined by pushing the sea back and getting out the diamonds that are there along the coast. The other point I wanted to make was the reason these are often such good quality is because diamond, as you might be aware, is the hardest known mineral on Earth. But it does fracture if you hit it just right. So in that case, if there are any imperfections in the stones, they will tend to break more easily than those that are perfect. And some of these you can see are lovely octahedral shapes. That's the natural crystal habit of the diamond. Here's another one. But other ones are rounded, and that's not because of the river rounding them. That's because they were resorbed in the actual magma in which they formed deep in the earth. Right, so that basically ends our trip up the far west coast, all the way up to Namibia. It's a beautiful country. It's very wide open. You have to plan more time to drive there. I would say it's a good full 8-hour drive to the border. So you have to plan more time to go up there than these local trips, but it's well worth it. And then what we're going to do in our final lecture tomorrow on Friday is we're going to go from Cape Town, and we're going to follow this red route past Paarl Rock through to Wellington and the Wagon Makers Valley, over Bain's Kloof Pass, into the Tolbach Valley, up Mitchell's Pass, into the Ceres Basin. We're going to check out Khwa-ttu Pass, and then we're going to come back through the Karoopoort and out into the Tankwa Karoo. And the point of this journey, I mean, the total drive is on the order of about 3 hours if you don't stop much. But the point of this journey will be to take you through the entire geological stack of deposits that exist between Cape Town and the Tankwa Karoo. Essentially, we'll go through the entire Cape Supergroup rocks, and we'll look at the spectacular exposures from these fold belt, huge mountains and the valleys through there. So that will be the theme for tomorrow.